A farmer decided to tear down an old rusty silo that had been standing idle for years. The metal was swollen, the walls were stubborn, and the first blow of the excavator revealed that there was no grain inside. What he found had been hidden for decades and was connected to a secret project that no one was supposed to know about. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The farm had not failed all at once. It had worn itself down year by year, season by season, the way metal thins under repeated stress until it no longer rings true when struck. Ethan Morrow understood this better than anyone. He had been born into the land, not as an heir to abundance, but as a caretaker of decline. The paddocks that once held thick grass now carried only stubborn scrub. Fences leaned in patient surrender. The water troughs stayed half-empty longer each year, their rusted rims marking the slow retreat of certainty. There was no single moment when the farm became unviable. It simply became quieter, thinner, more reluctant to give back what was demanded of it. Ethan rose before sunrise out of habit rather than hope. The mornings were cooler, but even then the air carried the promise of heat that would arrive without mercy by mid-morning. He drank his coffee standing at the kitchen counter, the mug cooling faster than he could finish it, his eyes resting on the same view he had known since childhood. The paddocks stretched out toward the low ridge in the distance, a geometry of lines and scars that told the story of generations who had tried to tame this place. On the table beside him lay a stack of envelopes he had already opened, then closed again, as though folding them shut might soften their meaning. The bank letters were polite, almost apologetic, but they did not bend. They spoke in dates and percentages, in conditional phrases that all ended the same way. If the numbers did not change, the land would. He pushed the letters aside and glanced at the photograph propped near the window. It was old, the edges soft from handling, the paper faded where sunlight had touched it too often. His grandfather stood in the picture, younger than Ethan was now, his face weathered but calm, one hand resting on a fence post as though it belonged there as much as he did. There was nothing remarkable about the image. No medals, no uniforms, no suggestion that the man had ever been anything other than a farmer. Ethan had always liked that about it. The ordinariness felt honest. The farm had come to Ethan the way it came to many men like him, not as a gift, but as a responsibility no one else wanted. His father had held on as long as he could, refusing to admit what the numbers had already decided. When the old man finally died, the land passed down with its debts intact, like a promise that demanded payment long after it was made. Ethan stayed because leaving felt like betrayal, and because part of him still believed that effort could compensate for time. That belief had thinned recently. The drought had stretched longer than forecast. Feed costs rose, machinery aged. The subsidies offered by the local council were small but tempting, contingent on one thing Ethan could still control: clearing unused structures and reclaiming overgrown sections of land. He had walked the boundaries with a measuring wheel and a notebook, tallying what could be removed without affecting daily operations. Sheds that no longer stored anything, fences beyond repair. And then there was the silo. It stood at the far edge of the eastern paddock, slightly apart from the other structures, as though it had never quite belonged. Tall and narrow, its metal skin was streaked with decades of rust, the original paint reduced to ghostly traces beneath oxidation and dust. A ladder ran up its side, or what remained of one, but several rungs were missing, others bent or eaten through, making the climb impossible without replacing half of it. The access hatch near the base had long since fused shut, its handle frozen in place by corrosion. Ethan could not remember a time when the silo had been used. Even as a child, he recalled it as a fixed presence rather than a functional one, something to be walked around rather than opened. What made it difficult to ignore now was the deformation. One section of the silo's side bulged outward, not dramatically enough to draw attention from a distance, but unmistakably wrong once noticed. The metal bowed in a broad, uneven curve, as though it had been pressed from within by a slow, patient force. It was not the sharp dent of impact or collapse. It was a swelling, a gradual displacement that suggested pressure rather than damage. The rust followed the curve, cracking along stress lines that had formed over years, but the steel beneath had not split. The rivets along that section were stretched, their heads elongated slightly, but none had torn free. Ethan had circled the silo more than once, running his hand along the warped surface, trying to reconcile what he felt with what he knew. Old metal warped. Heat and cold did strange things. Wind caught tall structures and worried them over time. These explanations satisfied him in the abstract, but not entirely in practice. The rest of the silo was straight. The deformation was localized, specific, as though something had chosen that spot and worked on it alone. He remembered asking his father about it once, years ago, when he had first noticed the bulge. The old man had shrugged and said the silo was older than it looked, that it had been standing long before either of them had reason to question it. When Ethan pressed further, his father had told him to leave it alone, not sharply, but with a firmness that discouraged follow-up. At the time, Ethan had assumed it was sentiment or superstition. Old men collected both. Now sentiment had little value. The silo occupied good ground, soil that could be seeded again if cleared properly. The metal itself, even in its corroded state, could be sold for scrap. Removing it would satisfy the council's conditions and free up space for a better layout. From every practical angle, the decision made sense. It was an obstacle, nothing more. Ethan decided to dismantle it rather than attempt to open it. The hatch was sealed beyond reasonable effort, and even if it could be forced, he doubted there was anything inside worth the trouble. Grain left too long became rot. Pests found their way in. Whatever the silo once held was gone. Knocking it down with the excavator would be faster, safer, and final. The morning he chose to do it was clear, and already warming. He drove the excavator out from the machinery shed, its engine coughing before settling into a familiar rhythm. The tracks bit into the dry earth, raising dust that hung briefly before falling back into the cracks it had come from. As he crossed the paddock, the silo grew larger in his field of view, its narrow shape cutting a hard line against the sky. Up close, the bulge seemed more pronounced. The metal reflected light unevenly, the curve catching the sun at an angle that emphasized its distortion. Ethan parked the excavator and climbed down, taking a final look before committing. He pressed his palm against the warped section. The steel was warm, the heat of the day already seeping into it, but beneath that warmth, there was a firmness he could not quite define. It did not feel fragile. It felt resistant. He told himself that this was nothing more than hesitation, born of fatigue and stress. When people were pushed too far, they began to assign meaning where none existed. He climbed back into the cab and adjusted the seat, the familiar smells of oil and dust grounding him. The controls were an extension of his body now, movements practiced enough to require little thought. He raised the arm and positioned the bucket against the deformed section. This was the weakest point, or should have been. Metal already under stress failed faster when pushed. That was basic. The first impact came with a sound that made him pause. It was not the sharp crack he expected, nor the tearing screech of metal giving way. It was a dull, hollow thud, as though the bucket had struck something padded or enclosed. The vibration traveled up the arm of the excavator and into the cab, settling in his hands in a way that felt wrong. The metal bowed inward slightly, then returned, like something flexing rather than breaking. Ethan frowned and pulled back. He checked the angle, adjusted his position, and struck again. Harder this time. The sound repeated itself, deeper now, accompanied by a faint tremor that seemed to ripple along the silo's skin. Dust fell from the rusted seams, but the steel held. He stopped the machine and sat still, listening to the engine idle. The silence around him felt heavier than before. Wind moved through the scrub, and somewhere a bird called, but the silo itself stood unmoved, its warped side unchanged except for fresh scuff marks. This was not how old silos behaved. Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the cab window, irritation rising alongside a thin thread of unease he did not yet name. He had expected resistance, not defiance. The structure felt less like a container and more like a shell, something designed to absorb force rather than collapse under it. He told himself he was overthinking it. Machines behaved differently under different conditions. Metal aged unevenly. He would apply more pressure, increase the force, and the problem would resolve itself the way practical problems always did, through persistence. As he reached for the controls again, a thought surfaced uninvited, drawn from a memory he had not revisited in years. His grandfather's voice, calm and steady, telling him once, long ago, that some structures were built to hold more than they showed. At the time, Ethan had assumed it was metaphor, another piece of old advice meant to sound wise. Now, sitting in the cab with his hands on the levers, the words took on a different weight. He pushed the thought aside and engaged the hydraulics. The bucket struck the silo again, and this time the metal responded in a way that left no room for denial. Instead of tearing, the outer skin buckled along a narrow line, peeling back just enough to reveal something beneath it that did not belong to a farm structure. Beneath the rusted exterior, there was another surface, smooth and dark, unmarred by corrosion. The glimpse was brief, a flash of clean metal before the outer layer settled back into place, but it was enough. Ethan cut the engine. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as though the land itself were waiting. He climbed down from the excavator slowly, every step measured, his attention fixed on the silo's wounded side. He approached and brushed away flakes of rust and dirt with his glove, exposing the edge of the tear. What lay beneath was unmistakable. This was not reinforcement added later, not a patch or repair. It was a second wall, thicker and intact, hidden behind the first. Ethan straightened, his pulse loud in his ears. The silo was no longer just an obstacle. It was something constructed with intent, something designed to appear simple while concealing complexity. The decision to knock it down had already been made, set in motion by steel and force. But standing there now, Ethan understood that whatever lay inside had been waiting far longer than he had been alive. He looked back toward the house, then at the excavator, and finally at the silo, its warped side catching the sun like a warning he had chosen not to see. The farm around him remained unchanged, dry and quiet, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and took a breath, unaware that this first breach had already committed him to a path that would not allow him to stop at demolition. The silo had stood too long, not because no one had bothered to remove it, but because it had been built to endure being forgotten. And now, with its secret surface exposed to daylight for the first time in decades, the land had begun to give up something it had been asked to keep. Ethan did not return to the excavator immediately. He stood close to the silo, the engine silent behind him, and studied the torn edge of rusted steel as if it might change shape while he watched. The outer skin had split reluctantly, curling back along a shallow seam that looked less like a failure and more like an incision. Beneath it, the darker metal caught the light without flaking or pitting, its surface smooth and uninterrupted, as though time had passed it by entirely. He reached out and touched it. The steel was cool despite the heat, and firm in a way that felt deliberate. This was not reinforcement hammered in by a farmer with spare material and a need for repair. This was something else entirely. He stepped back, letting his eyes trace the silo from base to crown. The deformation now made a different kind of sense, though he could not yet explain it. The bulge no longer looked like fatigue. It looked like accommodation, as if the outer shell had been forced to make room for something that refused to move. The thought unsettled him more than he liked to admit. He had grown up around machinery and metal, around things that failed loudly and honestly. They cracked, they collapsed, they announced their limits. This structure had not done that. It had endured. Ethan climbed back into the cab and restarted the engine, the familiar vibration steadying him. He told himself that whatever lay beneath the outer wall would reveal itself soon enough. Steel failed when pressed hard enough. There were no exceptions, only thresholds. He adjusted the arm and brought the bucket down again, striking closer to the torn edge this time. The sound that followed was lower than before, a deep, contained thump that resonated through the excavator's frame. The vibration lingered, traveling up the controls and settling into his wrists, not sharp or jarring, but sustained, as though the force had nowhere to escape. He struck again. The metal flexed visibly now, the outer skin rippling as if it were being pushed from both sides at once. Dust fell in thin curtains from the seams, but still there was no tearing. The inner surface remained hidden, except for the narrow glimpse already exposed, and even that showed no sign of strain. Ethan increased the pressure, leaning into the controls, with a force that would have flattened a shed wall. The excavator groaned in response, hydraulics straining, but the silo held, absorbing the energy in a way that felt almost calculated. He stopped and let the engine idle, his breath louder than the machine for a moment. Something about this was wrong in a way that resisted explanation. The silo did not feel empty. It did not sound hollow in the way abandoned structures did. The noise it produced had depth, a fullness that suggested enclosed space rather than absence. Ethan had heard that sound before, though never from a silo. He had heard it when striking sealed tanks, when pressure was contained rather than released. He climbed down again, moving closer, despite the faint warning tugging at the back of his mind. He pressed his ear to the metal and rapped it lightly with his knuckles. The response was muted, dense, as though the wall were thicker than it should have been. He moved along the circumference, tapping in different places. The sound changed subtly near the bulge, growing deeper, more resistant. The rest of the silo responded as expected, thin and resonant, a dead shell waiting to collapse. This section was different. Ethan straightened and wiped sweat from his face. He considered abandoning the attempt, at least for the day. There was no rule that said he had to finish this now. He could step away, think it through, come back with a torch or cutting equipment, and see what lay beneath more carefully. But the thought of leaving it half-opened gnawed at him. The tear in the outer wall had already revealed too much. Whatever was hidden, there had been exposed to the air for the first time in decades, and the idea of walking away felt like leaving a wound unattended. He returned to the excavator with a different plan. Instead of trying to crush the silo outright, he angled the bucket to pry, to peel rather than smash. He worked slowly, methodically, applying pressure along the weakened seam until the rusted steel began to separate with a protesting screech. The sound was harsh now, metal scraping against metal, but it was the outer layer yielding, not the inner. The torn sheet curled back in a wide arc, revealing more of the surface beneath. The second wall emerged gradually, and with it, the certainty that this was no accident. The inner metal was uniform, its thickness obvious even from a distance. It had been formed and fitted with precision, following the curve of the silo perfectly, but standing apart from it, a structure within a structure. Between the two layers, Ethan could see packed material, dark and dense, not debris but fill. Clay, perhaps, mixed with something heavier, compacted so tightly it had become part of the whole. He killed the engine again and climbed down, moving closer with the caution of someone approaching a live wire. He reached into the gap and scraped at the fill with his glove. The material resisted, hard as stone, and when he dislodged a fragment, it crumbled into fine dust that smelled faintly of earth and something else he could not place. He wiped his hand clean on his jeans, his thoughts racing ahead of his understanding. This had been built, not modified, not repaired, but designed. Someone had constructed a chamber inside a silo and then disguised it so completely that even decades of weathering had not betrayed it. The realization shifted something inside him, a subtle but irreversible change. The silo was no longer an inconvenience or an oddity. It was a deliberate act, a choice made by someone who had expected it to stand untouched. Ethan thought again of his grandfather, of the way the man had avoided questions, of the silences that had followed certain topics. At the time, those silences had seemed like personality, the reserve of an older generation that believed less said was better said. Now they took on a different shape. Silence could be protective. Silence could be strategic. He forced himself to focus on the task at hand. Speculation would get him nowhere. He needed to see more. He returned to the excavator and continued peeling back the outer skin, working carefully to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath. The rusted steel came away in sections now, each piece falling with a hollow clang that echoed across the paddock. The inner wall remained untouched, its surface unmarred by the violence inflicted on its cover. As more of the inner structure was exposed, Ethan noticed something else. The deformation of the outer wall aligned precisely with a subtle irregularity in the inner one. Not a bulge, but a faint distortion, a place where the metal seemed to have been pressed outward over time, and then held there. It was slight, easy to miss, but once seen, it could not be unseen. The pressure that had warped the outer shell had originated here, transferred through layers designed to absorb and distribute it. Ethan stepped back and took in the sight. The silo now looked less like a single object and more like a cross-section, a demonstration of engineering hidden beneath neglect. The thought made his stomach tighten. Whatever this inner chamber was, it had been subjected to forces that demanded containment, forces strong enough to reshape steel slowly, persistently, without ever breaking through. He realized then that the silo had not failed because it had not been allowed to. It had been built to endure, to hold something in place regardless of what time and weather did to its exterior. The bulge was not a sign of weakness. It was a record of stress managed, of pressure endured rather than released. The sun climbed higher as Ethan worked, the heat pressing down on him with growing insistence. Sweat ran down his back, soaking his shirt, but he barely noticed. His focus narrowed to the exposed metal, the compacted fill, the questions multiplying faster than answers. By midday, he had stripped away enough of the outer shell to reveal a broad section of the inner wall, and with it, a seam he had not expected to find. The seam ran vertically, clean and straight, interrupted only by a series of heavy bolts, spaced at regular intervals. This was not structural reinforcement. It was an access point. Ethan stood staring at it for a long time. Access meant intent. It meant that whatever was inside had been meant to be reached, serviced, monitored. This was not a sealed relic forgotten by chance. It was an installation. He felt a brief, sharp urge to stop, to seal everything back up as best he could, and pretend he had never seen it. That urge passed quickly, replaced by a harder resolve. The land had carried this thing beneath his feet for as long as he could remember. It had shaped his family's history in ways he was only beginning to suspect. Turning away now would not restore ignorance. It would only leave him with questions he could never answer. Ethan fetched tools from the shed, working with a care that bordered on reverence. He loosened the bolts one by one, each turn of the wrench a small act of commitment. The metal protested, but yielded, and as the final bolt came free, the seam shifted slightly, releasing a breath of air that felt cooler than the heat outside. It carried a scent of old metal and oil, of spaces that had not been opened in a very long time. He paused, hand resting on the edge of the seam, and listened. There was no sound from within, no hum or movement, only a dense, expectant silence. Whatever pressure had once existed here had long since settled into stillness, leaving behind only its traces. With a controlled pull, he eased the panel open. Darkness waited on the other side, not the dusty darkness of an abandoned shed, but something deeper and more contained. Ethan leaned forward, peering in, and felt the moment settle around him with a weight he could not shake. The silo had resisted him, not because it was broken, but because it had been doing exactly what it was meant to do. He had crossed a threshold now, not just of steel, but of understanding. The farm behind him, the debts, the calculations, all of it receded as the reality of what lay inside the silo pressed forward. The metal had not behaved correctly because it had not been ordinary metal. It had been part of something designed to last, to hold, to conceal. Ethan took a breath and stepped closer to the opening, unaware that this was the last moment in which the discovery could still be contained to the paddock alone. What waited beyond the inner wall would not stay confined for long, and once seen, it would begin to exert its own pressure, reshaping everything around it just as surely as it had reshaped the steel. The panel did not swing open freely. It moved with the reluctance of something that had been sealed with purpose, resisting the intrusion of daylight and fresh air as though it had learned to prefer darkness. Ethan braced one foot against the curved inner wall and pulled again, careful not to force it too quickly. The metal responded with a slow scrape, the sound drawn out and deliberate, until the opening widened enough to admit his shoulders. A breath of air flowed outward, cool and faintly metallic, carrying with it a smell that had nothing to do with grain or dust. It was the scent of machinery left idle, of oil that had settled into steel and stayed there. He stood at the threshold for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The light from outside reached only a short distance into the space beyond, fading quickly into shadow. He reached for the torch he kept clipped to his belt and flicked it on, angling the beam downward. The interior revealed itself gradually, not in fragments, but as a cohesive whole, a space that made sense the instant it was seen. This was not the chaotic interior of a repurposed structure or an improvised hiding place. It was ordered, measured, built to be entered and used. The chamber followed the curve of the silo, but at a reduced diameter, leaving the packed fill he had uncovered as a buffer between the two walls. The inner surface was smooth, its paint flaking in places, but still intact. The pale color dulled by time rather than damage. The floor beneath his boots was metal as well, level and solid, with a faint grid pattern etched into it for traction. There was no sign of rodents or nesting birds, no droppings or debris. Whatever this place had been, it had remained sealed tightly enough to exclude the small intrusions that claimed every neglected farm building. Ethan stepped inside, the torch beam sweeping slowly across the walls. The temperature dropped noticeably as he crossed the threshold, the heat of the day replaced by a coolness that clung to his skin. He closed the panel behind him part way, leaving it ajar to admit light and air, and stood still, listening. The chamber answered with silence, no hum, no echo beyond the muted one his movements created. The sound felt absorbed, as though the walls had been designed to swallow it. As his eyes adjusted further, details emerged. Along one side of the chamber, metal shelves had been bolted directly into the wall, their brackets thick and industrial. Several of them held wooden crates, their surfaces stamped with markings that made his stomach tighten. The stencils were faded but legible, the lettering precise and uniform in a way no farmer would have bothered with. Dates, serial numbers, abbreviations he did not recognize but knew enough to respect. These were not shipping labels meant for commercial distribution. They were inventory marks. He approached the nearest crate and ran his fingers along the lid. The wood was dry but sturdy, treated to resist moisture, and secured with metal bands that showed only the lightest hint of corrosion. He did not open it yet. Something about the arrangement gave him pause. The crates were aligned carefully, evenly spaced, as though someone had expected them to remain accessible. This was storage, not disposal. Opposite the shelves, a bank of equipment occupied the curved wall. Panels with dials and gauges sat mounted at chest height, their faces clouded with age, but intact. Wires ran from them into conduits that disappeared into the floor and ceiling. Ethan recognized the general purpose of some of it: pressure indicators, vibration sensors, readouts designed to record fluctuations over time. Others were unfamiliar, their functions hinted at by symbols and calibration marks that belonged to another era of engineering. None of it looked like it had been torn out or vandalized. It had been shut down, not destroyed. He moved deeper into the chamber, the torch revealing a narrow work table secured to the floor. On its surface lay tools arranged with a care that bordered on reverence. A wrench, a screwdriver, a set of calipers, all laid parallel, their handles aligned. Dust coated them evenly, undisturbed. Beside the tools sat a leather-bound notebook, its cover warped slightly but unbroken. Ethan hesitated before touching it, the sense of intrusion growing heavier with each step he took. This was not just a hidden room. It was a preserved moment. He picked up the notebook and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed but intact, the ink faded but readable. Columns of handwriting filled them, neat and deliberate, recording measurements, dates, observations. The entries were methodical, the tone professional. But beneath the discipline, he sensed urgency, a need to document precisely what was happening. He flipped through several pages, his torch beam tracing the lines. The dates spanned several years, clustered around the middle of the last century. The final entries grew shorter, the handwriting tighter, as though written under pressure. Ethan set the notebook down and turned his attention back to the shelves. He opened one of the crates, lifting the lid slowly. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were components he did not recognize, but understood instinctively were not agricultural. Cylinders of machined metal, coils wound with fine wire, sealed containers labeled with warnings he could not fully decipher. He closed the crate again, his pulse quickening. The chamber known now was no longer a curiosity. It was a record of activity that had no place on a farm like his. He moved to the far end of the chamber, where a metal cabinet stood flush against the wall. Its door was closed, secured with a simple latch. He opened it and found rows of folders, their tabs marked with codes and names. He pulled one at random and opened it, scanning the contents quickly. Typed reports, diagrams, correspondence. He did not read deeply yet. His eyes snagged on a familiar shape instead, a name printed on a personnel list tucked into one of the folders. Morrow. For a moment, the word did not register. Then it did, striking with a force that left him unsteady. He read the line again, tracing it with his finger. The initials matched. The surname matched. The date of birth matched what he knew from family records. This was not a coincidence or a shared name. This was his grandfather. Ethan sat heavily on the edge of the work table, the torch slipping from his hand and clattering softly against the floor. The chamber seemed to tilt. the walls pressing in as his understanding rearranged itself around this new fact. His grandfather hadn't been a peripheral figure, not a laborer hired briefly and forgotten. He had been listed with a role, a designation that implied responsibility. Technician. Operator. The words carried weight he had never associated with the man he remembered. Images surfaced unbidden. His grandfather sitting at the kitchen table late at night, staring at nothing. The way he had flinched once when a distant thunderstorm had rolled in, the windows rattling briefly. The silences, the refusal to answer certain questions. Ethan had always assumed these were the marks of age or temperament. Now they looked like the residue of knowledge withheld. He stood and returned the folder to the cabinet, closing it carefully. The discovery shifted his sense of the space. This was no longer an anonymous installation. It was a place his family had been tied to, whether willingly or not. The land he had inherited carried a history that extended far beyond crops and fences, rooted in decisions made under circumstances he could only begin to imagine. He took a breath and forced himself to continue. There would be time later to sit with the implications. For now, he needed to understand what this place was, how it functioned, and why it had been hidden so thoroughly. He moved to the equipment panels and examined them more closely, noting the labels etched into the metal. Frequencies, amplitudes, stress tolerances. The language was technical, but not incomprehensible. This was about measuring forces, about observing how structures responded over time. At the base of one panel, he noticed a spool mounted on a bracket, a length of magnetic tape threaded through a recording unit beside it. The device was old but well-maintained, its casing free of the corrosion that plagued the outer silo. He recognized it as a portable recorder, the kind used to capture audio logs before digital storage made such things obsolete, his grandfather's era. Ethan lifted the recorder carefully, testing its weight. The power switch was set to off. He did not turn it on yet. Some part of him wanted to delay that moment, to postpone hearing whatever voice might emerge from it. For now, it was enough to know that it existed, that someone had felt compelled to leave a record beyond written reports. As he explored further, he noticed something else. One section of the chamber floor bore faint scoring marks, shallow grooves that radiated outward from a central point. They were not scratches made by dragging equipment. They were the kind of marks left by vibration, by repeated micro-movements over long periods. The pattern aligned with the distortion he had seen in the inner wall, confirming what he had already begun to suspect. Whatever had happened here had exerted pressure not in a single event, but continuously, building and releasing in cycles too subtle to shatter steel, but persistent enough to reshape it. The realization brought the silo's bulge into sharper focus. The outer wall had not failed because the inner structure had absorbed and moderated the forces within, transferring them outward gradually. The deformation was a record, a slow-motion imprint of stress managed over years. The silo had been both disguise and buffer, its agricultural appearance masking a function that had nothing to do with storage. Ethan checked his watch, surprised to see how much time had passed. The afternoon light angled differently through the opening now, the sun beginning its descent. He felt the first stirrings of unease that had nothing to do with claustrophobia. He was alone on the property, standing inside a concealed chamber filled with evidence of a project he did not yet understand, one that bore his family's name. The isolation that had once felt like refuge now pressed in on him, a reminder of how far he was from anyone who could offer immediate help or explanation. He gathered the notebook, the recorder, and one of the folders, choosing them with care. He did not want to remove too much, to disturb the balance of the place more than he already had. These would be enough to begin with, enough to piece together a clearer picture away from the cold confines of the silo. He returned the panel to its place as best he could, though it no longer fit seamlessly. The breach was visible now, undeniable. As he stepped back into the open air, the heat hit him like a wall. The paddock looked unchanged, the same dry earth and scattered scrub stretching toward the horizon. The excavator sat where he had left it, inert and patient. Yet everything had shifted. The farm no longer felt like a simple inheritance or a burden of debt. It felt like the surface of something deeper, something that had been deliberately concealed and forgotten. Ethan closed the panel as much as he could and secured it loosely, more out of instinct than confidence. He stood for a moment with his hand resting on the warped steel, feeling the warmth of the sun on the outer shell and the cool memory of the chamber behind it. The silo had been a mask, and he had torn it away. Whatever came next would not be confined to the metal walls he had breached. He turned toward the house, the weight of the notebook and recorder in his hands anchoring him to the present. As he walked, his thoughts moved ahead, toward the questions that now demanded answers. The chamber had been built for a reason. The project it housed had left traces in steel and soil, and his grandfather, the quiet man in the faded photograph, had been part of it. The realization followed him across the paddock, settling into his bones. The silo had not merely hidden a structure, it had preserved a story, one that had waited patiently for someone to listen. Ethan did not go straight into the house. He set the notebook, the folder, and the recorder down on the tailgate of the ute, and stood there for a long time, staring across the paddock toward the silo. From this distance, with the sun lowering and the shadows stretching, it almost looked ordinary again. The warped side caught the light at a familiar angle, and for a moment it was easy to imagine that nothing had changed, that he could still turn back, finish tearing it down, and never look inside himself for the reasons it had been built the way it was. That illusion did not last. The weight of what he carried was not just physical, it pressed against his chest, steady and insistent, like a second heartbeat. Inside the house, the air was stale from having been shut against the heat all day. Ethan opened the windows, letting what little breeze there was move through the rooms, then cleared the kitchen table with a care that surprised him. He pushed the bank letters into a drawer without reading them again, wiped dust from the surface, and laid out the items he had brought in from the silo as though preparing for an examination. The leather-bound notebook went first, then the folder, then the recorder, which he placed nearest the power outlet, as if proximity alone might coax it into speaking. He sat down and opened the notebook again. This time, with more patience, the handwriting was precise, almost rigid, the kind that came from habit rather than inspiration. His grandfather had always written like that, Ethan realized. Even grocery lists had been orderly, each item aligned as though disorder itself were a kind of moral failing. Seeing that same hand now, filling pages with measurements and annotations, sent a slow chill through him. This was not the handwriting of a man dabbling in something he barely understood. It was the record of someone doing his job carefully, even when that job demanded silence. The early entries were technical and dry. Frequencies recorded at fixed intervals, amplitude readings. Notes on ground response measured through instruments Ethan only partially recognized from the diagrams sketched in the margins. The language was neutral, deliberately so, as if emotion itself had been filtered out before it could touch the page. Ethan read slowly, forcing himself not to skim, knowing that the meaning lay not in any single line, but in the accumulation of them. As the dates advanced, patterns emerged. The measurements began to change. Small deviations at first, noted and underlined. Adjustments made, parameters recalibrated. The handwriting remained steady, but the comments grew more frequent, as though the writer felt the need to explain not just what was happening, but why it mattered. Ethan's eyes followed the progression with a growing sense of unease. This was not a successful experiment marching toward conclusion. It was a controlled process, encountering resistance. He set the notebook aside and opened the folder, sorting through the documents inside. Typed reports alternated with handwritten notes, official correspondence stamped with seals he recognized only vaguely from history books. References to departments that no longer existed, committees dissolved decades earlier. The language was formal, precise, and evasive all at once. Ethan had the impression of reading something designed to satisfy oversight without revealing substance, a careful dance of words that said just enough to justify continued funding while concealing the risks involved. One report caught his attention. It outlined the purpose of the project in terms broad enough to be harmless. Structural response analysis, subsurface stability, infrastructure resilience. On paper, it sounded like an academic exercise, the kind of research that could be conducted anywhere with the right equipment. But the annexes told a different story. Diagrams of the local geology, cross-sections of the land beneath his farm, annotated with zones marked for testing. Notes about resonance effects when certain thresholds were reached. Warnings, couched in cautious language, about cumulative stress. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the pieces beginning to align. This had not been about a single test, or even a single result. It had been about sustained pressure, about observing how the ground behaved when subjected to repeated forces over time. Not explosions or sudden shocks, but something subtler. Vibrations, oscillations, the kind of stress that did not announce itself until it had already done its work. He turned to the recorder then, hesitating with his hand on the power switch. The notebook and documents told him what the project had been in theory. The recorder, he suspected, would tell him what it had been in practice. He plugged it in, listening to the faint hum as electricity reached components that had been silent for decades. The machine responded reluctantly at first, the reels twitching, then settling into motion with a soft, steady whir. For a moment, there was only static, a hiss like distant rain. Ethan adjusted the volume, his pulse quickening despite himself. Then a voice emerged, thin but unmistakable, shaped by the limitations of the tape, but carrying a presence that made his throat tighten. "My name is Samuel Morrow," the voice said, measured and controlled. "This is a personal record. It is not authorized, and it is not to be logged." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Hearing his grandfather's voice again, unchanged by time in its cadence and restraint, was like opening a door he had believed sealed forever. He listened, barely breathing, as the recording continued. The voice spoke of the project, in terms the documents had avoided, of expectations set too optimistically, of early results that had been promising enough to justify expansion, of pressure applied not just to the ground, but to the people involved, to meet objectives defined far from the paddock where the instruments were buried. Samuel Morrow described the equipment, the way the chamber inside the silo had been designed not only to house instruments, but to moderate the effects of what they were inducing. The inner walls, the compacted fill, the outer shell. Layers meant to absorb, to distribute, to delay failure. As Ethan listened, the image of the bulging silo wall returned with new clarity. It had been doing exactly what it was built to do, taking on strain gradually, protecting what lay beyond. The deformation was not a flaw, it was evidence of function. The recording went on, and the tone shifted subtly. The calm precision remained, but beneath it Ethan heard something else, a tension held in check by discipline. Samuel spoke of unexpected readings, of responses in the ground that exceeded models, of resonance effects that did not dissipate as predicted, but accumulated, creating zones of instability. He spoke of meetings, of concerns raised and deferred, of decisions made to continue despite warnings. There were discussions about shutting it down, the voice said at one point, and Ethan could hear the pause before the next words. Not because it was finished, but because it was becoming difficult to control. That distinction matters. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest. The project had not failed outright. It had produced results that frightened the people responsible for it. Results that suggested consequences extending beyond the immediate site, beyond the silo and its hidden chamber. The recording described the final phase in clipped, economical terms. An order to cease active testing, instructions to secure equipment, data to be archived under restricted access, the site to be sealed and left in place, its presence masked by agricultural infrastructure. No mention of remediation, no mention of long-term monitoring, just containment. "We were told the effects would dissipate over time," Samuel said, "that the ground would settle, that the structures we built would hold long enough for interest to shift elsewhere. There was no plan beyond that." Ethan opened his eyes and stared at the table, at the notebook and papers spread before him. The project had not been closed. It had been abandoned in a state of arrested tension, left to resolve itself under the assumption that time would do what engineers could not. The silo was not just a disguise, it was a compromise, a way of walking away without admitting what had been set in motion. The recording continued, Samuel's voice growing quieter, more personal. He spoke of his doubts, of the unease that followed him home, of the difficulty of explaining to his family why certain questions went unanswered. He did not name his wife or children, but Ethan heard the echoes of conversations that had ended abruptly, of a man choosing silence over honesty because honesty offered no safety. "If you are hearing this," the voice said near the end of the tape, "then the site has been disturbed. That means either someone ignored the warnings or the warnings were never passed on. In either case, understand this. The structures were designed to contain, not to eliminate. Pressure does not disappear simply because it is no longer observed. It waits." The tape clicked softly, then fell silent. The reels continued to spin for a few seconds before stopping, the machine settling back into stillness as though it had said all it was ever meant to say. Ethan sat unmoving for a long time. The room around him felt smaller, the air heavier. The farm outside, with its familiar creaks and distant sounds, no longer felt like neutral ground. It was a site, a location defined not just by ownership, but by history and consequence. The land had been used, measured, stressed, and then left to bear the results quietly. He stood and went to the window, looking out toward the silo. From here, he could see only its outline against the darkening sky. The bulge was no longer visible at this distance, but he knew it was there, a physical record of decades of managed strain. The realization settled into him with a weight that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with responsibility. This was no longer just about his grandfather's past. It was about what had been left behind, deliberately and without closure. The logic of the deformation became clear now. The inner chamber had experienced cycles of pressure, not explosive, but persistent. The steel had expanded and contracted in response, transferring stress outward through the compacted fill to the outer shell. Over years, those micro-movements had accumulated, reshaping the silo's skin without ever rupturing it. The structure had acted as a passive dampener, absorbing energy and preventing sudden failure. It had done its job too well. Ethan returned to the table and gathered the documents, organizing them into piles with an instinctive care that mirrored his grandfather's. He did not yet know what he would do with them, only that ignoring them was no longer an option. The project had been designed to fade into obscurity, to become a footnote buried under rust and neglect. By opening the silo, he had interrupted that plan. Outside, the light was fading, and the first stars were beginning to show. Ethan felt the day catching up with him, exhaustion pressing at the edges of his focus. But beneath the fatigue was a sharper awareness, a sense that the ground beneath his feet was no longer just soil and rock, but a layered record of decisions made in secrecy. The project had never been closed. It had simply been left behind, its consequences deferred. And now, with the chamber exposed and the record unearthed, those consequences were no longer confined to steel and earth. They were moving outward into his life, his land, and whatever choices he made next. As night settled over the farm, Ethan understood that the silence his grandfather had chosen had not been cowardice. It had been containment. And containment, like the silo itself, only worked as long as no one forced it open. The night after Ethan listened to the recording did not settle into rest. He lay awake in his bed, the house creaking softly around him, every familiar sound taking on an unfamiliar edge. The farm had always spoken at night, wood contracting, metal ticking as it cooled, distant animals moving through scrub. He had learned long ago which noises mattered and which could be ignored. Now that distinction felt blurred. Each sound seemed to ask a question rather than answer one, as if the land itself had begun to notice that something long contained had shifted. Near midnight he rose and walked through the darkened house, stopping at the window that looked out toward the eastern paddock. The silo stood where it always had, a darker vertical shape against the sky. From this distance, it revealed nothing of what lay beneath its skin, no hint of the chamber inside or the years of pressure it had absorbed. It looked like what it had always pretended to be, ordinary, harmless. Ethan wondered how many people over the decades had passed it without a second thought, and how carefully that illusion had been maintained. He slept eventually, but not deeply. When morning came, it brought with it a sense of urgency that had nothing to do with the sun or the heat. Ethan dressed quickly and went outside, walking the perimeter of the paddock as he often did. Though now his attention was sharper, his awareness tuned to details he would once have dismissed. He noticed tire tracks near the boundary fence that had not been there before, faint impressions pressed into the dry soil. They could have been made by anyone, he told himself. A contractor cutting through, a neighbor turning around. Still, he paused beside them longer than he meant to, crouching to examine the pattern before straightening again. The rest of the morning passed in uneasy productivity. Ethan fed the stock, checked the water lines, attended to tasks that demanded physical focus. He avoided the house, where the documents lay waiting, and avoided the silo, whose presence he felt even when he could not see it. By midday, the sense of being observed had grown stronger, not as a certainty but as a pressure, subtle and persistent, the same kind of pressure he now understood so well. It was mid-afternoon when the first visit came. Ethan heard the vehicle before he saw it, the sound of tires on gravel reaching him from the drive. He turned from the shed and watched as a dark sedan rolled to a stop near the house. It was not a vehicle he recognized, not the dusty utes common in the area, but something newer, cleaner. Two men stepped out, both dressed plainly but neatly, their movements controlled. They did not look around with curiosity. They looked around with purpose. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and walked to meet them, stopping a few paces short. The taller of the two offered a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Morrow," he said, as though confirming something already known. "We're with a regional safety commission. We've received a report of unauthorized excavation activity on your property." Ethan did not ask who had made the report. He already suspected the answer. He nodded once, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm clearing old structures," he said. "Nothing illegal about that." The second man, shorter and older, glanced past Ethan toward the paddock. His gaze lingered for just a moment too long in the direction of the silo before returning. "We understand," he said. "However, some structures erected in previous decades can present hazards if disturbed. Contamination, instability. We're here to ensure there's no risk to you or the surrounding area." The words were carefully chosen, broad enough to mean almost anything. Ethan felt the first clear edge of anger cut through his caution. "You're welcome to look from here," he said, "but this is private land." The taller man's smile tightened slightly. "Of course. We're not here to make trouble, just to gather information." They asked a few more questions, all framed innocently. How long the silo had been there, whether Ethan knew when it was built, whether he had noticed anything unusual during demolition. Ethan answered with equal care, offering nothing he had not already decided could be said safely. The men listened, nodded, thanked him for his time, and left without pressing further. As the sedan drove away, Ethan stood watching until the dust settled, his jaw clenched. They knew. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to come looking. Enough to test his responses and measure his willingness to cooperate. The visit left behind a residue of tension that did not dissipate with their departure. It lingered, seeping into the afternoon like heat into metal. That evening, Ethan noticed that one of the crates he had left in the chamber was no longer where he remembered it. He stood inside the silo, torch in hand, staring at the empty space on the shelf. He was certain he had not moved it. The panel he had secured showed no obvious sign of tampering, but that meant little. Whoever had built this place had known how to open it without leaving marks. It followed that someone else might too. He did not sleep at all that night. Over the next days, the signs accumulated. A fence gate left open when he knew he had closed it. A tool missing from the shed, then reappearing days later in a different place. The sound of a vehicle idling briefly on the road at night, then moving on. None of it was dramatic. All of it was deliberate. Ethan recognized the pattern from the documents and the recording. This was pressure applied gradually, designed to unsettle without provoking open confrontation. The second visit came a week later, this time with paperwork. The men arrived in a different vehicle, but their manner was the same. Polite, controlled. They carried a folder and spoke of surveys, of temporary assessments, of the possibility that certain areas of the property might need to be restricted for safety reasons. They mentioned his grandfather by name, casually, as though dropping it into conversation were an accident. "Your family's been here a long time," the taller man said. "Which means there are records. Old ones. Sometimes they surface when people start digging." Ethan felt the warning land exactly where it was meant to. After they left, he sat at the kitchen table with the folder open before him, the language of the document blurring as anger rose to replace unease. They were not asking for permission. They were establishing a framework that would allow them to take what they wanted when they chose. The project might have been abandoned, but the authority behind it had not vanished. It had simply waited. That night, the pressure escalated. Ethan woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment he lay still, unsure whether it was real or a memory intruding on sleep. Then he heard the crackle. He was on his feet instantly, pulling on boots and running outside. The old machinery shed was burning, flames licking up its side where dry timber met stored fuel. Someone had poured accelerant. The fire moved with intention. He fought it as best he could, dragging hoses, beating at the flames, until the heat drove him back. By the time the fire died down, the shed was a blackened shell, its contents ruined. Tools melted, papers reduced to ash. The message was unmistakable. This was not vandalism, it was a demonstration. Ethan stood in the smoke, chest heaving, and understood that the people who remembered the project did not intend to let it be uncovered quietly. The project had shaped them as much as it had shaped the land, teaching them that secrecy was not just a preference, but a method. They were willing to erase evidence. They were willing to apply pressure until resistance collapsed. In the days that followed, Ethan made his decision. He stopped trying to handle it alone. He copied everything he had: the notebook, the reports, the recording. He stored the copies in multiple places, mailed one set to a trusted acquaintance in town, left another with a journalist he knew only slightly, but trusted more than the silence that had protected the project for so long. Each act felt like a release of pressure, small but cumulative. The visits stopped after that. The vehicles no longer idled on the road. The gates stayed closed. The quiet returned, but it was a different quiet now, one that felt like recalibration rather than retreat. Ethan knew better than to believe the attention had vanished. It had merely shifted. Standing once more at the edge of the paddock, looking at the silo, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The project had been built on the assumption that secrecy would outlast curiosity. That assumption had been wrong. The land remembered. The steel remembered. And now, so did he. The people who still remembered the project were not finished. But neither was Ethan. The morning the story broke, Ethan did not listen to the radio. He did not check his phone. He went out before sunrise and stood at the edge of the eastern paddock, watching the light creep slowly across the land. The soil looked the same as it always had, cracked and pale, carrying the marks of seasons that had taken more than they gave. The silo rose from it in quiet defiance, its damaged side turned slightly toward him. The wound he had opened, now impossible to deny. For the first time since all of this had begun, Ethan felt neither fear nor urgency. What remained was a steady awareness that whatever happened next would no longer be contained to his choices alone. By mid-morning, it was impossible to ignore the noise. Vehicles arrived on the road, stopping and starting. A news van parked near the gate, its presence tentative at first, as if uncertain whether it was welcome. Then another followed, and another. People began to gather at the fence line, neighbors mixed with strangers, drawn by the kind of attention that rural places rarely attracted unless something had gone very wrong. Ethan watched from a distance, letting them come to him rather than the other way around. The journalist he had trusted arrived shortly after, his expression tight with a mixture of triumph and apprehension. He told Ethan that the documents had been authenticated, that the recording had been verified by experts who recognized the equipment and the voice patterns. The project name, long buried in archives that few people ever accessed, had surfaced again. It appeared in places it was never meant to appear. Parliamentary committees were asking questions. Agencies that no longer officially existed were being referenced in public hearings. The silence that had protected the project for decades had been fractured beyond repair. Ethan listened without comment. He had expected vindication to feel different, louder perhaps, more satisfying. Instead, it felt like standing too close to a fault line after the first tremor, aware that whatever came next would be larger and harder to predict. The official response followed quickly, as it always did when denial was no longer possible. A statement was released, acknowledging that experimental infrastructure had once existed in rural areas under wartime and post-war research initiatives. The language was careful, engineered to concede without admitting liability. There were expressions of concern for landholders affected by historical activities, promises of review, assurances that no ongoing risk had been identified. Ethan recognized the tone immediately. It was the same tone he had heard in the reports his grandfather had helped write. Formal, controlled, designed to contain. Within days, a team arrived to assess the site. They were not the same men who had come before. These people wore visible insignia, carried equipment openly, and spoke in terms of compliance rather than implication. They erected temporary fencing around the silo and began documenting it from every angle, measuring the deformation, photographing the exposed inner wall, scanning the chamber inside. Ethan was permitted to watch, but not interfere. The land, at least for now, was no longer entirely his. As the assessment progressed, it became clear that not everything was still there. Several crates listed in the inventory records were missing. Sections of equipment had been removed, their mounting bolts cleanly cut rather than corroded away. The recorder had not been the only thing taken out of the chamber over the years. Someone had returned after the project's abandonment, selectively removing materials deemed too dangerous or too revealing to leave behind. The realization did not surprise Ethan. It only confirmed what he had already learned. The project had not ended. It had been managed. The officials documented the absences carefully, noting discrepancies between archived lists and physical reality. Ethan wondered how many of those notes would ever translate into consequences. Some names in the records belonged to people long dead. Others belonged to institutions that had changed their names so many times they were functionally untraceable. Responsibility, like pressure, had been redistributed until it no longer rested anywhere specific. When the work was finished, the fencing came down. The silo was declared inert. No active instability was detected. No measurable hazard remained. The assessment concluded that whatever effects the project had once produced had dissipated over time, absorbed by the ground and the structures designed to contain them. The language was reassuring, final, the kind of language meant to close a chapter. Ethan watched them leave, their vehicles disappearing down the road, and felt a familiar frustration rise and then settle. He had not expected justice in any conventional sense. The exposure itself was the reckoning. The truth, once spoken aloud, had altered the balance more effectively than any legal outcome could. In the weeks that followed, the farm changed again, this time in ways that were less visible but no less profound. The bank letters stopped coming. A review of land records resulted in a temporary suspension of foreclosure proceedings, the authorities unwilling to be seen seizing property now associated with a public scandal. Grants became available, framed as compensation rather than apology. Ethan accepted them without ceremony. Survival, after all, was not an ideological position. He returned to the silo one afternoon alone, long after the last official visit. The outer shell had been stripped away further during the assessment, leaving the inner chamber exposed in places like bone beneath torn skin. The structure looked smaller now, diminished without its disguise, yet still imposing in its precision. Ethan walked around it slowly, his hand brushing the cool metal as he passed. The bulge that had first drawn his attention remained, frozen in its final shape, a permanent record of stress endured and contained. He did not enter the chamber again. He had seen enough. Whatever remained inside belonged to history now, not to his need for answers. Instead, he sat on the ground nearby and let his thoughts wander to his grandfather. He imagined the man standing where he stood now, younger and burdened with knowledge he could not share. The silence that had followed him through his life took on a different meaning in that light. It had not been ignorance. It had been restraint. The land, Ethan realized, had always carried more than crops and fences. It carried decisions. It carried the weight of experiments conducted in the belief that outcomes could be controlled, that consequences could be delayed indefinitely. The silo had been part of that belief, a structure designed to make pressure invisible. Its rusted exterior had invited neglect. Its strength had ensured survival. As autumn approached, Ethan began dismantling what remained of the silo, this time under no illusions. The metal came away more easily now, its secrets exposed, its purpose fulfilled. He worked slowly, salvaging what he could, letting the rest go. When the inner chamber was finally gone, the ground beneath revealed itself to be unremarkable. Solid. Quiet. Whatever instability had once been induced had long since settled into equilibrium. In its place, Ethan marked the spot with a simple post driven into the earth. He did not inscribe it with names or dates. He did not call it a memorial. It was a marker of acknowledgement rather than remembrance, a way of saying that something had been here, had mattered, and had been addressed, however imperfectly. Life on the farm resumed its familiar rhythms, altered but intact. The attention faded as new stories took its place. Reporters stopped calling. Officials stopped visiting. The land returned to being just land in the public imagination, its hidden history filed away again, this time with footnotes and references rather than silence. Ethan carried on, older in a way that had nothing to do with time. He understood now that some structures were not meant to be dismantled without consequence, that some rust existed not as decay, but as camouflage. The project his grandfather had worked on was gone, dissolved into records and hearings, its physical presence erased. But its lesson remained, embedded in Ethan's understanding of the place he called home. Standing at the edge of the paddock one evening, watching the sun sink behind the ridge, he felt a quiet certainty settle over him. The land remembered because it had been forced to. The steel remembered because it had been shaped by pressure rather than failure. And he remembered because he had chosen to look instead of turning away. What remained beneath the rust was not danger or mystery anymore. It was truth, exposed and weathered, no longer capable of being contained. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. More stories like this are already waiting for you on the channel. Share this video with someone who loves real mysteries and hidden truths, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.